Nations Foreign Minister who's visiting Australia for about 5 days. Dr. Mochtar is a former Professor of Law and Minister for Justice. He fell out with the previous regime toward the end of the Sukarno years and took time out in the United States to acquire expertise on law of the sea and in developmental and economic law. All matters, of course, of considerable importance now to Indonesia and to Australia in his current position. He's been Foreign Minister since 1978. In past years, Dr. Mochtar has not spared Australian politicians and policies, speaking of them rather dismissively. Of Australian media, he's been even more forthright, particularly in reportage and interpretation and comment on East Timor and Irian Jaya. However, this visit appears to be different. Dr. Mochtar has been emphasising Indonesia's and Australia's similarities. Dr. Mochtar.
Thank you, Madam President, and I wish to start by saying how much I appreciate and am thankful for this invitation to speak here before you and the chance to meet members of the press and other persons interested in Indonesia and relations between Indonesia and Australia. You made the flattering introduction that I was rather dismissive of Australian politicians. I thought that I was at the receiving end of the stick. Your remarks made me forget the introductory line that I was going to use when I assumed the rostrum, and that was that I realized that there is no such thing as a free lunch. So I guess I have to sing now. Speaking of my visit, the purpose of my visit is a return visit for the various visits paid by my good friend Bill Hayden. I think in all he has made 3 visits to Indonesia. So I really think it's overdue. And it was 78, I think, that I visited Canberra on an official visit. I remember this place. I was told by the president that this is the very Bacchus tavern that I went to in the early 70s when it was first established. It was great excitement then to have a first real restaurant in Canberra. But since then, Canberra has changed very much, and I'm really impressed by what has been built and has been developed here in Canberra. So maybe I ought to come here more often. During my visit, I have met with Prime Minister Hawke to discuss wide-ranging topics, not only bilateral ones, but also regional ones, and global matters. But we reached the same conclusion, more or less, and that is that it would be well if both countries and their leaders in the future emphasize the similarities rather than enlarging the differences. We both feel, I hope he shares my feeling, at least I can speak for myself, that if Australia and Indonesia see eye to eye on such important world problems as disarmament, nuclear testing, the preservation of peace in general, economic matters such as commodity problems, multilateral round of negotiations, North-South dialogue, matters on which we broadly agree, if we could really show that we cooperate on these matters, and indeed we have cooperated on these matters very closely, then it will bound to have an impact that will go beyond this region. Because while we do not presume to be big powers, you will agree that both Indonesia and Australia are not insignificant. I have also met my good friend Bill Hayden. I've had a 2-hour discussion with him and discussed, of course, foreign policy matters, bilateral, regional, and global. I was particularly interested in the South Pacific Nuclear-Free Zone Agreement, which I thought was a very important development in which Australia took a very important part, a leading part, I was told. And we are interested in this because we have been contemplating to establish a nuclear weapons-free zone for Southeast Asia. But there are some impediments or stumbling blocks towards its realization. One of the most important being that Indonesia happens to be an archipelago sitting astride very important sea lanes. And that was the main difficulty, because there is an inherent conflict of interest between the big powers that need free transit for their vessels, including naval vessels, and our wish to preserve the area and archipelago for peaceful purposes and exploration and exploitation to raise our standards of living. Now, I see that the South Pacific Nuclear-Free Zone Agreement does point the way out of this dilemma, because it does include provisions that would enable a transit passage to be conducted through the nuclear-free zone. So I have been a very careful listener and a very thankful recipient of advice. So I can assure the chairman that I have definitely changed my attitude towards Australian politicians. And in any case, it was not quite true what she said. I thought it was meant as a compliment either, or a dig at her compatriots. I don't know which. Maybe both. I also had talks with Mr. Gareth Evans, Mr. Kim Beazley, and I was relieved to hear him say that we are not a threat, and even if it were, we don't have the capability anyway. I assured him that we don't even have the intention. Our interest mainly being centered on our own needs for economic development and reconstruction. I'm afraid that here Indonesia's image is too much based on our past behavior. People very often forget that there has been a change of regime, and that this regime is completely different. This is not the one that engaged in confrontation and all those things. In fact, I was, as the president so clearly said, I was dismissed by the former regime and sent into exile to study the law of the sea, which has come in good stead So you never know what something is good for. I have become quieter because I, as a student and a young professor, was always very critical of the then regime. And it was good, I think, that they treated me that way, because it taught me some humility. And I was forced to use my time to study useful things like the law of the sea. I discussed with Mr. Evans some aspects of the Timor Gap problem. And then we discussed also, I had a session with the Joint Committee on Foreign Affairs and Defense. Very good session, I thought. And also met members of the opposition, my Ian Sinclair and Mr. Peacock, an old friend of mine. In fact, the gentleman who invited me in '78. I also met the Minister of Trade, trying to look for ways how to have more trade between Australia and Indonesia, which is not an easy thing to do. We have done all we could. I mean, the officials and the bureaucrats have been having meetings all over the place, very intensive, and yet not much is occurring, not much trade is increasing. So we came to the conclusion, in fact I was the one that said it, we have led the horse to the water, but we can't seem to make it drink. So maybe you can. I also paid a courtesy call to the Governor General, and I was honored that I was invited to a luncheon, and we had a very interesting conversation of the role that Sir Stamford Raffles played in the history of Indonesia. He was very surprised to find that the reason we drive on the left is because that was introduced by Sir Stamford Raffles, because everybody expects Indonesians to drive on the right, being a former colony of the Dutch who drive on the right themselves. But somehow we drive on the left side of the road, and people are puzzled why we do that. That's because Sir Stamford Raffles was briefly in Indonesia, 3 years after the defeat of the French at Waterloo, when he took over briefly the reins from the French before giving it back to the Dutch. That was enough to introduce driving on the left, land tax, write a very important book on the history of Java, establish the botanical garden in Bogor, and order the excavation and restoration of the Temple of Borobudur. So you see, when you are energetic, what you can do in only 3 years. And we are very thankful for his contribution to our history. And I don't think we aim to change the driving rule, because that would be too confusing. And we would have to change all the way we build our cars, you know. We discussed a lot of other things, civic cooperation, and we also signed, this is very important, a memorandum of understanding on Australia's participation in co-financing with the World Bank. You know that our development plans are financed by a consortia of countries called IGGI, which are coordinated by the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank. By participating, Australia is channeling its assistance through this group, and it's a good arrangement because there is a provision that says that the assistance must be used to purchase Australian products. So it will help Australian industry, I think. So this is a clear case of helping others who then in turn also help you. This is the way the world works. Well, there are other things we discussed, of course, but I would leave some time for questions which I am happy to answer, because it is my experience it is much better to leave time for question and answer, because that way I will be sure that I'm addressing my remarks to things that you are interested in. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Mochtar. I'm aware of quite a long list of questions, and so we'll start them off immediately, reminding people that they state their name and that of their organisation clearly. And the first is from Savitra.
I have 3 questions. Some critics have attributed the recent flood of border crossers to increasing feelings of alienation by Irian Jayans after 20 years of both informal and formal transmigration from other parts of Indonesia. Has any thought been given by the Indonesian government to introducing positive discrimination for Irian Jayans, thus ensuring them guaranteed participation in higher education, in the local and central government, in the media, and maybe in the diplomatic corps, in a manner similar to the Malaysian government's policy with regard to its Bumi Putras or the US government for its minority groups. The second question: as recently as last Sunday, the Australian Minister for Aboriginal Affairs, Clyde Holding, said that Aboriginals, in terms of enjoyment of basic human rights, are the most disadvantaged and vulnerable people in Australia. The reality is not that Aboriginal people have failed Australian society, so much as the fact that Australian society has failed to understand and respect of Aboriginal people. Given that the Australian press and some politicians have been quite vocal recently about the consequence of 20 years of transmigration to Irian Jaya, do you have any comments to offer on the consequence of 200 years of European transmigration to Aboriginal lands? And thirdly, the US has lost its bases in Vietnam. Would Indonesia be drawn closer together to Australia and PNG in the event of the Americans losing their bases in the Philippines, coupled with the suspension of the ANZUS Treaty as a consequence of New Zealand's policy of banning physical nuclear arms and policies?
Yes. Oh, thank you. I was told to keep on standing. I hope my legs are strong enough. The first question, it's a good question, which in fact boils down to the fact, is there positive discrimination with regard to Irian Jaya, meaning that they get a better treatment other than the national norm? I would say yes, because for instance, in the admission to the Academy for Officials of the Interior Ministry, the Minister of the Interior has told me that they have a slightly more lenient criteria for Irian Jayas to be admitted to the Academy as compared to other Indonesians. We hope it is a temporary measure, and there are similar measures in other areas as well, because we do not feel that this is the right way to go about it. Eventually we hope that it is no longer necessary, but there is this special treatment. The question started with a question whether I saw the outflow of a few thousand people out of Irian Jaya into PNG as a result of alienation. I do not deny that there might be some feelings of alienation of Irian Jayans, but I think that the greater number of those people have crossed the border because they were made afraid. They have been told that things were going to happen. They were told that life on the other side is much easier. You don't have to do anything. And although there is a small portion that those that held in the camp in Blackwater, I think, that have left for political reasons. So we do make this distinction, but I don't think it is correct to state that they all left for political reasons. And then the second question was Aborigines? Well, frankly, I haven't paid much attention to that because we have a policy in our government not to interfere in other people's affairs. This is new to me, and while it's interesting, I will not go into it. But I think that our policies in Irian Jaya are precisely designed to prevent such a thing. I mean, when you have a complex culture with different levels of advancement, and you attempt to introduce a certain portion of it into the mainstream, then you must be very careful in doing it in a very gradual manner. And it is for this purpose that, amongst others, that the transmigration program has been introduced into Irian Jaya. I must add that it was at the express wish of the present governor, who is an Irian Jayan himself, and it was only at a rather late stage that Irian Jaya was included in the transmigration program. It has been going on for decades. In fact, it started during Dutch colonial times, and it was a means to establish growth centers outside of Java, because the demographic situation in Indonesia is such that you have 90 million people living on Java, which is not a big piece of land, and a few million in Sumatra, another few millions in Kalimantan, Sulawesi, and barely 2 million, I think under 2 million in Irian Jaya. So it is a matter of distributing the chances of development to those areas that lack manpower. And it is by no means only Javanese that are moved out, Balinese also. For instance, the people, farmers that have been moved to East Timor are primarily Balinese, a very gentle people. I'm not denying that there may be problems, and we ourselves are concerned. I remember it was last year, I think, that there was a big seminar in Jakarta organized by newspaper editors, attended by scientists, anthropologists, economists, that were rather critical of the existing policies, recommending improvements. And this is a process that is continually going on. So we might be in the process of finding a way of effecting an acculturation process without the negative consequences that usually occur in a clash of two cultures. And we might end up coming up with a solution and preventing things that happened in the American continent, and according to your information here too. The third question was?
I think we've covered them now.
Oh.
Those two questions were from Savitri, who is from Compass newspaper of Jakarta and working here in Australia. The next question is from Hamish McDonald.
Hamish McDonald, Far Eastern Economic Review. As you might know, Australia is one of the few countries that teach Indonesian language in its school system. But in recent years, this has been declining somewhat. I wonder if you've discussed any kind of cultural aid program for Australia, perhaps by providing Indonesian teachers to Australian schools to put some momentum back into that program.
That is a very good and practical suggestion. In fact, the President asked me whether I found my job interesting. I thought I won't answer that question because it might be splashed over the papers, but I try to keep it interesting by engaging myself in new things, and my recent interests are the promotion of Indonesian art and culture abroad. And to this end, I have, as a private person, established a foundation. Now, if you think of art and culture, you think of dances and all that, but you'd be surprised that the first major project I undertook was the promotion of Indonesian nouvelle cuisine. And it is so successful that it's now a permanent feature on the menu of the Jakarta Hilton. And I'm rather proud of it. And if I want to be remembered later, it is as a man who developed Indonesian food to the level of cuisine. And I took the courage to introduce it in New York at a dinner we organized on October the 3rd. And believe it or not, it made the New York Times. So because I have these interests, I find foreign affairs a very interesting job, and I will add promotion of language to the list. So thank you for your suggestion.
Deborah Snow.
Deborah Snow, Australian Financial Review. Dr. Mochtar, notwithstanding the assurances you've just given on Irian Jaya, there is a body of opinion in Australia which fears that Irian Jaya will be the next major irritant in Australian-Indonesian relations, eclipsing even East Timor. What do you say to those people, and do you believe that greater access for Australian and other non-Indonesian media to Irian Jaya would help dispel suspicions about Indonesian policies in that province? And finally, could I ask you about the Indonesian government's attitude to the new Winti government in Port Moresby, and what plans you might have for working with that government to minimise anti-Indonesian sentiment in PNG?
As to the first question, I take note of your prediction that Irian Jaya is the next irritant between our two countries. So we seem to have different jobs. My job is to remove irritants, and some people's job is to develop them. So in a way, we keep each other busy. Well, it's fair enough. I mean, we each have our own job, and one of the things that people like in the press conferences is I say to the journalists that, I have these weekly things. It's not necessary for us to agree because we have different jobs. I conduct foreign affairs, try to smooth relations, and you are writing for newspapers. And so I take note of that, and I try to do my job to smooth relations. And if the visit of Australian journalists will help that, I will discuss it with the authorities in Indonesia. But I will ask those journalists to be fair and objective, because what we have witnessed very, very often is that they emphasize too much the negative aspects. So when you read about Indonesia, it is as if it's a terrible place. It's not so bad, really. And even Irian Jaya is not all negative. You might want to know that there are many Australian missionaries working there, and they are making a very positive contribution, and they cooperate very well with the civil administration and the military, and it's quite unique. And they're mostly Protestant, I think. The Catholics are mainly Dutch. They're English, they're Americans, they're Italians, they're all nationalities. And they all are motivated with the same aim to better the conditions and the life of our brothers in Irian Jaya. So I think it will be helpful, but I'm not promising anything because it's the province of the Ministry of Information. And another thing that would be essential, I think, for journalists, any journalists, including Australian journalists, is also to have not come with a preset kind of attitude. What I mean is the attitude must be open. There must be a willingness to admit that Indonesians can do a good job, that they can be good administrators and things like that. Because I'm afraid in the past the attitude has been too much conditioned by this idea that Indonesia is a threat, you know. And when you think that way, you are conditioned. One is that Indonesia is a threat, and the other is I forgot. But put those things together, it makes it difficult. So I agree that there should be more contact, more open discussion, more admission of each other's failings, both Indonesian and Australian side. And if there is willing to do that, as I admitted that our policies in Irian Jaya are not perfect, but they are being improved gradually. One good thing we did in Irian Jaya, I think, we got them off drinking too much beer. Right from the beginning, and has a very salutary effect because they now produce the best football team in Indonesia, very good boxers, and increasingly as you go to the coast, they perform equally like other Indonesians. And when you talk about Melanesians, people forget that the Ambonese, the South Moluccans, the Moluccans in fact are Melanesians. So there might be more Melanesians in Indonesia if we put them all together than maybe in other parts of this region. So we do not think in those terms. We think in terms of Indonesians. And the thing is how to bring them together, minimizing the negative effects of direct contact. That's why Irian Jaya for a long time access was limited, even to Indonesians, because we thought that if the more aggressive type of Indonesians came, for instance those from North Sumatra, or the people from Makassar, if they were introduced too fast into the region, and they have a reason to come there because it's part of Indonesia, it might have less desirable consequences. You see, so the policies have been quite wise, I think. But we have lifted that restriction, I think, 10 years ago, because we could not justify that, because the other Indonesians say, why can't we travel there? It's our country. So it's a very difficult thing. On the one hand, we want to ease the introduction of these people into the mainstream with a minimum negative effect. On the other hand, we don't want to victimize the other Indonesians who are very dynamic. You know, these I almost said tribes. These fellow tribesmen, these fellow North Sumatrans of our ambassador, they don't need a transmigration program to travel all the way to Iran Jaya. You know, they take care of themselves. How they do it, I won't tell here because some are not very commendable. And there are other regions where my wife comes from, West Sumatra, very enterprising people. And the Makassar, the Bugis, are very enterprising people. They have been sailing as far as Madagascar. And they used to sail way back hundreds of years ago to your northern coast. I mean, these are different types, you see. Now, if you let these people freely interact with those that are of a different culture, who are more laid back, who don't work so hard and all that, then the weaker ones are going to lose out. So there is a policy of protection up to a certain point, and as I said, positive discrimination. But in the end, when you think of the nation as a whole, there is a limit. There is a limit. And this is a very careful balancing, and when the limit is reached, sometimes we feel that the limit has been reached, and then we treat them equally. Then they feel that they are disadvantaged, and perhaps this causes alienation. So it's not as easy as it is looked from outside, but what we do prevent is that they will not share the fate of the American Indian, or, as you told me, of the Australian Aborigine. And that's a tall order. But we might succeed. Thank you.
Radio Australia Indonesian section. I'm from North Sumatra too, Mr. Mochtar. My question is, in view of the first grouping of Southeast Asian nations, of which Indonesia is, I think, a very strong component, which has been followed now by the grouping of the South Asian nations, do you see Asia being sectionalized in this fashion?
No, they need not be sectionalized. I think it's a very good arrangement, because I think Southeast Asians have a different style of going about things than South Asians. And if you mix them, I think that would cause unhappiness. So why create? So that's why they created their own club, so to speak. Southeast Asians are more easygoing, flexible, give and take type of thing, consensus type of thing. But when you go further west, they are more argumentative, you know. I mean, different. It's a different type. And so it's good that they are starting their own, so they can have their debates amongst themselves instead of arguing with us. It's not the fragmentation, because if they get their act together, then we may establish a bridge, like we are establishing bridges to the South Pacific nations, which are even more laid back than we are. So it seems that if you move to the east, you get more laid back for some reason. Because if you go further west from South Asia, you land in the Middle East. They're very energetic there. If you look at the TV reports, they seem to be, I mean, getting into each other's ways and shooting at each other with great gusto. And, well, that's not the kind of style we conduct our affairs. So there is a sense of having these separate groupings. As long as on important world problems we agree, like we don't want nuclear weapons, things like that, you know. So if the good example created by South Pacific were followed by Southeast Asia, and if we could infect the South Asian with this good idea, instead of this neutral threat of Pakistan being accused of building nuclear weapons, and in turn then India saying that we can do it too, why don't they agree not to have it, and have a nuclear-free zone and devote the money spent then on economic development? But these are dreams. But foreign ministers have to dream.
However, perhaps not quite so discursively here and now. That goes for the questions as well as the answers, because we've got many questions.
Oh, I'm sorry.
The next is from Bruce Dudley.
Bruce Dudley, Australian Business Magazine. Minister, you said earlier that the public servants, the officials and the bureaucrats have been having meetings all over the place, but trade isn't happening. Is that, what reason are there that trade is not happening? Is it because of political strains between Australia and Indonesia? Are you here, in fact, being particularly nice to us and to our ministers and your good friend Bill, in order to try and do something about the trade situation? And has it got anything to do with the fact that with the collapse of OPEC and the decline in world oil prices, Indonesia's medium-term economic situation looks slightly sick?
Well, the problem is that both of us are free economies in the sense that trade, while can be negotiated by bureaucrats and officials, are actually conducted by businessmen. Now, businessmen seem to feel that there is not much profit in importing things from Australia or from Indonesia, vice versa. Perhaps because all products, and I say all products, are relatively expensive as compared to other producers. It is a fact that both Indonesia and Australia, for some reason, are fairly high-cost producers, and the items that are similarly produced by other countries. That is one reason. Another reason is that traders usually like to trade with familiar trading outlets, and it's very hard for us to persuade them to try to find new markets for some reason. But we have to keep on trying and identifying products that can be profitably sold both ways. And I was thinking of wood and timber products, plywood and things like that. And it's up to the businessman then to go out and conclude a contract.
David from the Age, Dr. Mochtar. My question starts from the point of oil revenues. As we all know, Indonesia's development program is largely underpinned by oil. Indonesian revenues from oil are declining, I would imagine now, as a result of price falls that already occurred. It could fall catastrophically. Transmigration is a fairly expensive program. Given the decline in those revenues, is transmigration considered high or low priority? If transmigration would be maintained, what other development programs would be cut back in order to continue to finance that?
That is a very difficult question to answer right now, because usually we spend several cabinet sessions to come to a decision like that. So I'm afraid I can't answer it. But it is obvious that as oil prices fall, we have to cut back on some of the programs, either eliminating marginal programs or cutting down the size of each program. So there is a choice of retaining programs, but making them smaller, or eliminating fancy stuff, But I leave that to the experts. I'm not an expert. I hesitate to talk like an economist here. I know that I'm not.
Bill Goodall, the Canberra Times, Dr. Mochtar. Would the Indonesian government now be prepared to accept international monitoring, say by the UNHCR or the Red Cross, of any large-scale return of the border crossers in Papua New Guinea to their homes?
We have never been opposed to the UNHCR engaged in the exercise, as long as the repatriation itself is handled by both countries as a bilateral, on a bilateral basis. So it would have to be UNHCR PNG doing their thing in that territory, UNHCR Jakarta doing their thing on our territory. But that question hasn't come up because they haven't returned in sufficiently large numbers. But we have asked, and he has reacted, the PNG ambassador, and I think the Australian ambassador also, to make a trip to Irian Jaya and observe for himself the preparations that we have made and the extra budget allocations to prepare for the return of this border cross. But it first has to happen, and that's not yet happening in large numbers.
Michael Dodd from ABC's PM program, Dr. Mochtar. I wonder how dismissive you would be of Australian politicians if the Australian government decided to accept Irian Jayan refugees on a large scale, and would you be critical at all of Australia if Australia acted to house Irian Jayan refugees on a temporary basis before finding them homes in third countries, such as the one suggested by our own Immigration Minister, the potential home of Austria?
First, I don't feel I have been dismissive of Australian officials. It was a comment made by the President, not mine. Secondly, I would regard such a question as an entirely Australian internal question to be decided by themselves, and I would make no comment, because it's a policy of Indonesia, especially in foreign affairs, not make comments in other countries' affairs.
Dennis Atkins, Melbourne Sun, Dr. Mochtar. About 2 months ago, the Port Moresby administration did send 12 border crossers back to Irian Jaya. I was wondering if you could tell us what has happened to those border crossers. There were reports in Port Moresby that they had been put in jail.
These two, if I'm not mistaken, were engaged in criminal acts according to the PNG authorities, and their treatment in Indonesia, of course, depends on what their record were before they fled. If they had not done anything, then they would be left free. If they had to answer for a breach of law in the past, then they would have to answer that as they would in any other country.
Dr. Mochtar, Gary O'Neill from the Melbourne Herald. A year or so ago, a meeting like this would have been dominated perhaps by the Kampuchean issue. I was just wondering, has the negotiation of a peace settlement in Kampuchea faded as a priority in Southeast Asia? Or is it in fact true that over time Vietnam was always going to get its own way in Indochina anyway?
No, I think interest has picked up lately over the Indonesian proposal for a cocktail party, and I have had positive responses so far from 3 prospective parties to the cocktail party. That is Prince Sihanouk, who, by word of Prince Ranarit, Son San seems to be inclined towards accepting it, because although he hasn't said so. And I just got word from Hanoi, from our ambassador in Hanoi, that Phnom Penh would be willing to participate. The remaining party which has not yet given indication is the Khmer Rouge. So that is the latest thing. Another thing is the Indonesian initiative to link the settlement of the Kampuchea question with American Hanoi normalization. I know you may ask why we did that. We did that to make settlement of the Kampuchea problem and withdrawal of Vietnam out of Kampuchea palatable for them. Because here we have, for almost 7 years, been trying to persuade Vietnam to leave Kampuchea. Now, logically, they ask, what do I get for it, you see? And by having the prospect of normalization in the United States, which is very important from an economic point of view, to be followed by other Western countries and Japan, who is very eager to resume trade investment in Vietnam, it would be an attractive proposition for Vietnam. And one already sees indication of that in their willingness to solve the MIA question, which used to be a very difficult question. So the signs are quite positive.
Tony Nice from The Age, Dr. Mochtar. In your talks with Mr. Hayden and Senator Evans today, did you come any closer to working out the details for administering the joint development zones? And do you think the recent World Court decision on the law of the sea has strengthened Indonesia's negotiating position?
Well, I prefer Mr. Evans to impart the news to you, but we found the discussions very useful. We agreed, however, to delegate it back to the technical negotiators, and we tentatively agreed that they should meet again sometime in March, and the prospects look good.
Paul Kelly from News Limited, Dr. Mochtar. The other morning you attended a breakfast with senior Australian newspaper executives. I wonder if you could tell us whether, as a result of those discussions, you are now prepared to encourage the Indonesian government to accept more Australian media correspondents in Jakarta.
I will try.
Bruce Jones, AAT, Dr. Mochtar. I wonder if you could outline to us what worries there may be within ASEAN about the situation in the Philippines, and also what do you think about recent calls to stop defence aid to the Philippines, and what strategic implications this might have for the area?
I would rather not comment on the situation in the Philippines, adhering to the firm policy of the Indonesian Foreign Office not to comment on internal matters of other countries.
Patrick Walters, Sydney Morning Herald, Dr. Mochtar. I was wondering if you could comment on the breakdown in the ANZUS Treaty, the dispute between New Zealand and the United States, and would you be able to offer your assessment of that?
Well, I'm afraid I have to make some comment. I cannot keep saying no comment. that would be boring. Now, for a change, I would say, like any interested onlooker, witnessing a possible breakdown, all I hope is that it will not occur. It's like witnessing something happening to somebody's marriage, you see. Then you hope that they stay together. Because one doesn't know what's really happening, you know, as an outsider. So all you can do is hope.
Thank you.
That's better than no comment, right?
It is indeed. Thank you very much. In saying thank you very much to you, Dr. Mochtar, I will admit that I did actually ask him if he liked his job as Foreign Minister enough to carry on trying to keep it after the end of the current Repolita, which is, I think, only about 2 years to go, and what job he might like after that. And all I can say is he was as evasive in private conversation as he was in referring to that publicly here and now. However, I would still like you to remember this occasion of addressing the National Press Club and to accept the National Press Club.
Oh, thank you.
And thank you.
Thank you very much.